Hello everyone. Can you hear me well? So welcome. Today we have a very interesting panel about censorship-resistant protocols, Oracle-less versus Oracle-integrated approaches. So we're here with a bunch of different people from very different backgrounds, and we're going to try to explore the differences in the approaches. We have people that actually work for Oracle companies. We have people representing the opposite side, so Oracle-less protocols, and we also have Chainsecurity members and Chaos Lab members, which will give us a different perspective on the topic. So without further ado, I would start with a short round of presentation. Maybe Mario, you want to start?
Sure. So my name is Mario. I work for the Pyth Data Association, and I'm a contributor to the Pyth Network. So as you guys know, Pyth Network is a first-party data oracle which specializes in financial data. So we work with pretty much all the data providers, ranging from traditional finance players, but also a lot of the crypto players as well, ranging from financial institutions and also traders and market makers.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brenda, and I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Tellor. We're a decentralized oracle. We are, we claim and we say this with all confidence. We are one of the few oracles where if the team was to go away, you could still get your data. That's how decentralized we are.
I'm David. Nice to meet you all. I'm the head of BD at Ajna Finance. We're a new-gen DeFi protocol that's designed without oracles, without governance, to be fully immutable. And likewise, if our team disappeared, the protocol would work just fine. And actually, our team did disappear. We dissolved in January, so yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm Torgin. I work at Chainsecurity. I do smart contract audits there, and I'm specialized in oracles, I would say. So I wrote a paper on the Uniswap oracle, for example, and how you can mess with it. And yeah, I just like breaking stuff.
I'm Barry. I'm the lending vertical lead at Chaos Labs. We are a quantitative risk firm working with teams such as Aave, Venus, Banky, and GMX. And we are recently entering the oracle space in the context of risk oracles, where we can effectively enshrine our risk simulations through real time, such that we can optimize parameter optimization in a better way and more effective way.
Okay, thank you everyone for the introduction. I think, given the name of the summit, we can skip questions like what an oracle is, because I hope everybody has a fairly decent understanding of the question. But I would still like to know from Brenda and Mario, like what actually makes your oracle different, especially from a censorship resistance point of view.
Yeah, right. So pretty much like I said, so Pyth is a financial data oracle, specializes in financial data. We work with a lot of data providers from traditional finance side of things, but also at the same time the crypto side of things. You look at the traditional finance side of things, we work with a lot of data providers like CBOE Global Markets, MIEX, MEMEX, and other US regulated exchanges that provide US equities, FX, and also other types of assets into the Pyth network. And also at the same time, we work with a lot of crypto players like Binance, OKX, Bybit, and all these other kind of like traders and market makers like Wintermute, Aros, Galaxy Digital, and any other kind of like big financial institutions in the crypto side of things, and they provide data directly to Pyth. With regards to the censorship kind of like stance on things, so the way we work is that all the data that the data providers submit, like it's pretty much, they are aggregated directly into what we call as our own application chain called PythNet, where pretty much all the data providers have to submit their data continuously every 400 milliseconds. Because, yeah, so, and also at the same time, because all these kind of like data providers are aggregating data directly to PythNet, we are kind of like, as the Pyth network ourselves, like we don't have an ability to actually tamper some of these data. So in that sense, in terms of the censorship kind of like aspect of things, we don't really censor anything in terms of the data inputs whatsoever. And also at the same time, because we have so many of these data providers, right now we are working with 120 of those data providers. A lot of these data are pretty much aggregated, and pretty much it goes without censorship whatsoever.
Thank you. Brenda?
Yes, so in terms of decentralization, the way that Tellor works, it's everything from anybody that wants to become a data reporter, they have to stake on chain. They risk losing that stake via dispute mechanism that it also happens on chain, and to begin a dispute is only 10% of the stake, so that incentivizes people to to want to do this because they can make money. So, like I said, without the team, that can still continue to function. And in terms of censorship, any type of data that anybody wants, the only thing that they need to do is basically save the definition, or what we call the data spec. We do ask them to put them on our GitHub, but they do eventually have to register it on IPFS so that everybody is aware of the data that is needed. The data has to be, in a way, publicly verifiable so that anybody can dispute it. And so we don't have any parameters of things that people can or cannot ask the Oracle. However, those definitions have to be clear enough that people are willing to risk their stake, because that's a lot of money, to provide this type of subjective data. Or if you ask a really bad question or a really controversial question, then they have the option of not answering. But in general, any data that anybody needs can be asked for, and anybody that wants to participate in the network can participate in the network without the team having to approve it.
Thank you, Brenda. So, David, can we instead go on the other spectrum, on the other side of the spectrum, and see how Ajna actually went radically different?
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever I tell people that Ajna is an Oracle-less DeFi protocol, they look at me funny and they scratch their heads. They're like, how? How's that possible? Where do you get the prices from?
That was my reaction.
Yeah, and I had the same reaction when I first learned about the protocol as well. And the short answer that I give people is that the protocol is designed such that it outsources the function of the Oracle to the lender and the liquidator. So when a lender lends an Ajna, they deposit into a specific price bucket. So they're choosing a price that's some discount to market, adjusted for volatility, thinking, okay, like I'm willing to lend to a borrower at this price, and it ends up being, a price range. And so the system has a reference price from which to lend, from which to let borrowers borrow against that collateral. And then on the liquidator side, we have a mechanism called a liquidation bond. So in order to liquidate a position, you have to put up a percentage of their debt, and if the collateral auction clears at or below the liquidation price, then you get paid. But if it clears above the liquidation price, you actually lose your bond. So we have a really great economic incentive for a liquidator to act honestly. And between those two things, guess what? You have a DeFi protocol that doesn't use oracles. And yeah, that's the short answer.
Thank you, David. So now I would like to have Barry and Torgin play the role of the fact checkers here. One from the security perspective, the other from the risk perspective, and tell us a bit more of like what are the different trade-offs, both technically and like from a risk perspective. So Torgin?
Yeah, I think that essentially an oracle will always add risk no matter how it's implemented, right? You can like try to make it the best possible oracle, but at the end of the day, you still have like external data that you're relying on for correctness of your protocol. And so you need to be very careful in how you use that. I think that the oracle-free approaches are really cool. So the main ones I know are Ajna, and there's another protocol called Frankencoin, which is kind of similar, but it's a stablecoin protocol. And I think it's very cool that these protocols, like even if, they don't have the reliance on external data. So you know that you can use this thing like in 100 years. You don't have any reliance on external things. And it's just important to understand the trade-offs. So I think in general, for the oracle-free approach, you need liquidations that are quite slow because you're finding your liquidation price through a Dutch auction where you need to give the market participants time to see that the auction is happening and get the tokens that they need and all that stuff. And then also you don't want the price to decline too quickly and things like that. So I think that's important to keep in consideration. But yeah, I think it's very cool that it's even possible to have these kinds of protocols without oracles at all. And I think that there's probably also more room for innovation. So yeah, I'm super curious to see how it continues and if people come up with more cool ideas that eliminate this risk factor of the oracle.
Can I actually add to that?
Of course.
So another one of the trade-offs is actually UX versus like less systemic risk and eternal functionality. When you sacrifice oracles, you're putting that job on the end user. Like that's one of the reasons that Ajna actually has been struggling to find product market fit. The lender has to be the oracle, and guess what? Lenders are pretty lazy. Nobody wants to do that. So oracles, I think, as a component of your system design are a huge unlock for UX. They do make things more efficient, but they do introduce systemic risk. So I just wanted to add to that as one of the fundamental trade-offs.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess building off of both of those things, specifically the first thing, obviously you mentioned how being reliant on third parties, and generally we think of consensus mechanisms when it comes to Oracle providers, but also simply something around VWAP aggregation or the underlying closed-sourced data provision, where the underlying Oracle network is actually gathering this from. How is this actually being calculated? And this, in a general sense, alongside the inherent permissionlessness approach, allows for unlocking 100 years, we can still have Ajna around. And as far as the trade-offs, you once again mentioned this UX component about how a lender is not a lender on Aave, let's say. A lender on Aave is very passive. The payoff function of a lender on Ajna is much more complex. And as a result, we can get, even as it relates to UX, we also have the capital efficiency component where naturally on Aave, 90% of all supplied ETH is actually being utilized as collateral, A tokens. And this is simply would not be possible on an Oracle-less lending protocol. And when we think about ETH supplies simply, and its functionality such that it can be borrowed for, say, LST looping and all of that, this capital efficiency component, in addition to like the dynamic liquidator incentives, which are much more constraining in this sense, we now have to build a protocol that takes all of these tail risks into account, which are not necessarily present in something like Aave, where we have like this continuous updating of some push oracle, let's say.
Thank you. So I think we had a bunch of very different perspectives around the subject, and maybe something I would like to ask to follow is something that actually comes from what Brenda said. That is, like to get a proper answer, you need you also need to ask a proper question. That is, will you always be able to like get a proper answer or to get an answer at all? I'm thinking about liveness. So for the audience, liveness, if you look at the definition by the book, it's simply eventually something will happen. So we need like oracles to answer, otherwise they would be effectively censoring something. So how can we, I would like, this is a question for like Brenda and for David. How can we be sure that like liveness is guaranteed? So I would say in one sense, for Brenda is basically the question is more on how can we be sure that an answer will come to the question, even if it's malformed. Maybe, I don't know, the question could, do you somehow curate the questions to be sure that like they're done in a correct way?
No, because then you will be introducing some censorship there too, right? So you don't want to censor neither your users or your data providers. Mm-hmm. The way that you actually get an answer is if it is a high-risk type of question or high-risk type of query, you gotta tip more. You gotta be able to be willing to pay those reporters for the risk that they're taking. So either that, or the second thing that you could do is actually implement some proper time, after settle with time. So you can say like if you were to ask about an election, like the Maduro election in Venezuela, if they would have asked who will take over power, that would have been a better question. Or if they would have just waited a little longer to settle, that could have been enough. A lot of these hacks, I feel like they actually exploit the impatience that we have in crypto to get either data or do the next trade or whatever it is that we're rushing through. But ultimately, if there is a higher risk, there's got to be a higher pay. That's how you insure it, and that's why I wouldn't want the team to be the one censoring. We want it to be as neutral as possible so that everything can happen, and then it's just up to you how much you're willing to pay.
So in some sense, this is somehow similar to an approach where you do not provide a liveness guarantee, but somehow you, like the author of the question somehow is like taking the responsibility.
Yeah, so for our system, anytime that somebody wants data on chain, they have to signal to everybody. So they have to post a payment on chain. They don't have to go through the team. So yeah, it has to go, it shifts the liveness to, I guess, responsibility to how much you're willing to pay. It's just like whenever there's like high congestion on Ethereum, for example, on Black Thursday, maybe somebody would have paid a lot more gas or had a way to incentivize those updates, then maybe those transactions would have gone through. But there's got to be that mechanism for people to either pay for the risk or pay for the gas.
Thank you, Brenda. So going on with David, I guess for Ajna, from Ajna's perspective, liveness is, will somebody eventually get liquidated? So how can we make sure that liquidations happen? I think I can tell like a personal story about this. We had at Curve, we had a YCRV liquidation, a big YCRV liquidation happening on Ajna back in the days, and it was quite complex to get people to liquidate that position. So I'm actually curious, how do you guarantee that this happens also for more exotic assets, for example?
Yeah, definitely. Well, so Ajna, it's designed so that there can either be settlement exogenously with outside capital, or actually endogenously with the lender deposits that are sitting there in the pool. So for the YVCRV, I forget the exact ticker it was, if there did not come an external bid, whenever the price of the Dutch auction hits the top lender price bucket, you can match it off and settle the debt that way. So that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is, of course, the liquidation bond mechanism that makes sure that actually there is a financial incentive. So there's kind of two things. There's two different kinds of markets. This is how I like to think about it. There's liquid markets where there's very great secondary market liquidity. You can make a quick arb. External capital loves these kinds of liquidations because it's really easy to close the full trade. But then there's the niche markets, and this is where Ajna really tried to find product market fit, the long tail of assets in crypto. But these don't have liquid secondary markets. Sometimes, like you don't have even a good reference price at all. Like, what's fair? A 50% haircut? Is the lender really has to be an expert in pricing, and the lender has to be willing to be the person who's gonna ultimately buy that asset. So that's part of the reason why the long tail market has struggled, because it requires like bespoke lenders that are willing to take that risk. So liveness for us is not a question of like Oracle-less or with an Oracle. We've put all of the incentives inside of the system such that it should work. It's just a mismatch of like the right parties to like get a certain kind of loan done. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
Could that be more of a problem of like, maybe there's just not a market for that, and that's fine too, there's just, it just dies.
Yeah, absolutely, and actually, but the interesting thing is sometimes you don't know if there's a market because there's no way to communicate. So one of the projects that I did with a colleague of mine is we launched ajnamatch.com, and it's literally just a bulletin board. If you're a borrower and you have some sort of borrower request, you could put it up. If you're a lender and you have like something you're willing to lend against, you could put it up on the site. The site hasn't gotten too much traction, unfortunately. I definitely try to shill it every time I can, but I think it's a discovery thing too, because niche markets, like, they can exist. It's just a matter of like getting the counterparties to communicate and discover the opportunity. Yeah.
Maybe, Barry, you want to add something on top of that regarding the risk side of things?
Yeah, for sure.
Something we often hear is like long-tail assets are like they're not very profitable, so it doesn't even make it worth it to take the risk. This is at least Ava's approach, which I'm not sure you know very well.
Yeah, so I think it's about 97 or 98% of all collateralized debt positions on Aave are simply through majors. And so when we consider like the effective, obviously there's this contingency on some Oracle, and all of the associated economic risks with low liquidity and the sort, and parameterizing caps and loan to value ratios and all that. However, when we think about the aggregate market for long tails, it is still finding its path, and I wouldn't say it's so defined right now, where we can see billions, where we can scale with these long tail assets in terms of them being utilized as robust collateral assets. And I guess one more note I wanted to mention on the trade-offs pertaining to the lender about how it sort of differs from Aave's approach of simply like irrespective of its ability to be utilized as collateral. This is something found in many lending markets, but simply supplying the underlying asset to be lent and the guarantee that that can be withdrawn at any point in time, parameterized through some interest rate curve with an optimal utilization point, which determines that there can be sufficient liquidity left over so that users can withdraw. This is something that is not the case in Ajna. Perhaps in Ajna, it's more of a buffered approach where, say, we have some sort of volatility in the underlying asset that's being lent out. We are now contingent on the liquidator and lender dynamics before the lender himself can obtain that underlying asset back. So this, in general, when we think about lending as in traditional finance or just lending, Ajna is more so, I see it as like you need these sophisticated lenders, but the payoff function is not necessarily of a lender, which is it's a very interesting approach. But I would not compare it in the same way to something like Aave.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, the way that the system is designed, it does require a more sophisticated lender, and typically you want to get paid for that.
Yeah.
And you're getting like passive lender payoff, and sometimes even less, when you should be getting compensated more. So that's definitely some friction that we've had in adoption on the lender side. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. So maybe getting back to Mario, because one of Pyth's strong selling points is definitely speed. But I'm also curious to know, like, what are the trade-offs here in terms of like censorship resistance to get this speed? I know you guys use, for example, wormhole as a messaging layer to make sure that like the message comes from the Pyth network to whatever network you want to get the message to. So how can we make sure, for example, the wormhole does not become a central point of failure?
Okay, so there are a few nuances to this. So I think first of all, when it comes to censorship resistant, or basically kind of like a censorship thing that you mentioned just now, so we work extensively with wormhole to make sure that the data themselves like are not kind of like censorship or like censorable, right? So in that sense, we kind of like, the way wormhole is structured is that there are 19 guardians. They are thoroughly observing our kind of like app chain that I mentioned earlier in the part of the panel, which is called Pythnet. And basically, kind of like as an observer of the network, all these 19 guardians need to come to a consensus, 2/3 of them, which is like 13 of the 19 guardians available, to make sure that all the data are indeed coming from Pythnet, and also at the same time, kind of like they can make sure that kind of like all these data are not kind of like censorable, right? And at the same time, when it comes to the liveness of the things that you mentioned just now, we work extensively with wormhole over the past kind of like 3 years to make sure that they are kind of like the primary kind of like bridge for a lot of our data coming from Pythnet to whatever kind of like chains that we support to this day, right? So with regards to kind of like the liveness, of course, there are kind of like problems maybe that, recorded with wormhole maybe in the past or whatsoever, but they've worked extensively very hard to make sure that these problems don't like never occur again with regards to like Oracle liveness and whatsoever. And we also make sure that we can make sure that kind of like our Oracle or Pyth Oracle works to its kind of like best liveness possible as well, to make sure that kind of like we can bring the best data quality in terms of liveness, and also at the same time to all the users that are currently using Pyth. Because right now we have about 400 different applications, and all of these different applications live on 80 different chains, and a lot of protocols are reliant on Pyth, and we want to make sure that we can deliver the best data possible with regards to kind of like expectations of all these protocols. So yeah, with regards to liveness, we work extensively with all of our partners to make sure that the liveness is something that we can address directly head on.
Thank you very much, Mario. So maybe following on this point, I would like also to know from Torgin, but also this question is open for all of you guys. If you managed to see some common like mistakes that lead to like liveness failures, maybe you had to also deal with some like in your own protocol with some liveness issues. That could it be like this could be, for example, that like a liquidation not happening for David case. This could be like an answer not coming and like somebody complaining or being unhappy about it for an Oracle. Or maybe also like for Barry, like if you saw some situations where the Oracle was effectively like preventing something from being liquidated, like I would like to do a quick tour and see, starting from Torgin, like how can we prevent these mistakes? How can we be sure that like these things don't happen? And like, do you have experience with this kind of things happening, for example?
Yeah, so I think the most common cases that I know of are just when you have really bad network congestion, and then it just becomes super expensive to post updates.
So
and
in a way, the internet becomes a trust assumptions for oracles.
well, I mean like Ethereum congestion, not.
Yeah, but.
Yeah, I guess. But yeah, so I mean that's obviously just a cost problem. And then the other one is that if you have, so in order to not have weird outliers, or sometimes data is kind of cleaned so that you have outlier detection and stuff like that. But of course, sometimes there are actually outliers in the data, right? And so I think this is another dangerous part. I mean, I think the most well-known one of this is that when we had the Luna crash, there was a Chainlink Oracle that just had a minimum price set, right? Which usually you don't expect your asset to go down by 1,000x or whatever it was, but sometimes it happens, right? So I think basically you just need to be careful whenever you're aggregating your data in some way. You want to avoid outliers, but you want to make sure also that in the cases where these are actually true, that you're also handling that. So yeah, it's a hard design question. But yeah, this is the main thing that I can think of right now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the answer. Maybe I wanted to clarify, when I meant the internet, I was saying we often talk also about like geographic diversity of validation, because it's really important to guarantee liveness. Like if the internet were to go down in the US, that could have an impact also on the Ethereum network. So that was what I kind of meant. And maybe on this point, like does geographic diversity count also for you guys at Pyth? Because of course you have a network running.
So absolutely. So I think with regards to geographic diversity, as I said, so a lot of our data providers are actually also validators of the network, which is the BitNet kind of like app chain. So a lot of these kind of like data providers pretty much are spread all over the world. We have a lot of data providers based in the US, of course, but also at the same time, we also have a lot of data providers based in Europe, Asia, and so on and so forth. And they kind of like spin up their own validators in different parts of the region as well. So you can take a look when it comes to kind of like geographical diversity. I mean, validators are definitely kind of like are one of the strongest suits when it comes to kind of like geographic diversity. So a lot of the data kind of like the node validators are Asia, Europe, and then US, and pretty much all other parts of the world. So yeah, I think with regards to geographical diversity, that's something that we really take things really seriously, and we also want to make sure that we can keep continuing, make sure that we have as much geographical diversity as much as possible, in order to make sure that we can avoid from bad things from happening.
Thank you, Mario. So I guess starting from this, we could also talk about your case, Brenda, because I would say in your case, we don't have nodes to validate. So So
I don't know where the reporters are, but I believe for sure Europe, the US, and Asia, and that's mostly because of people, even though we don't do KYC or anything like this, when they're just required to stake, sometimes they do ask for help, and so then that's what we know, like, okay, maybe we don't understand them, like we're trying to, some things get lost in translation, and that's how we sort of know where some of them are. But it is an open system, so for us, it's very difficult to mandate somebody needs to open up something. You know, it's basically goes back to rewards. It's like if we offer enough rewards, where is it cheap enough for them to run this and be competitive and be able to earn those rewards. So
absolutely,
it's important, but we can't enforce it.
Yeah, of course. But as long as the economic incentive is strong enough, I guess it makes sense to just, some people want to assume that someone will come. And if they don't, maybe it's because there is not a market for it. It's not relevant enough. So yeah. Continuing with David, did you have issues with like people like getting very angry, for example, because liquidations did not happen or something like this, or somehow like the protocol handled this thing like gracefully?
Yeah, definitely. There were, I'm thinking of one instance in particular where our deployment on Arbitrum, we had some loan, I think it was like cow USDC pair. Somebody got liquidated unfairly. The person who liquidated the loan did lose the liquidation bond, but then unfortunately what happened was nobody was paying attention. So we did actually make deals with certain parties to actively monitor certain pools and certain networks and participate in liquidations to, try to boost the liveness of that and make sure that these opportunities are spotted and competed for and like actually, done. But in this case, it was a pool for a relatively unpopular token on a network where we did not establish any deals with anybody sorry, I'm mincing my words here. And the person took a pretty severe haircut, and it was unfortunate. As a result, though, a few more people started paying attention because the person who ultimately got the collateral made a very nice profit. So, nature kind of heals itself, but not without its casualties, unfortunately. Yes. So there's definitely a bit of like a liveness issue with longer tail assets and newer blockchains, but
economic incentives to the rescue somehow.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not really like I don't think even having an oracle would have solved that. I think it's just a matter of are people aware that there is an opportunity here, and in many cases, there's just so much going on that they're not aware. There's a million layer 2s, there's a million protocols, there's, how do you get the limited amount of participants in our industry to really participate? Yeah. Thank you.
So maybe going back to Barry, I'm actually curious if you have some criteria when considering oracles, like do you have some sort of like proper scoring for oracles to make sure that they guarantee like liveness, they guarantee like the correctness, and like do you manage also like how important is liveness in that scoring if you have one, for example?
So I wouldn't say that we definitely look at historical data with respect to specific blockchain networks, Oracle networks, and sort of look at instances whereby we have seen issues and then sort of gauge accordingly. Obviously, when it comes to the Oracle network itself, they each have their own, and I mentioned earlier how they each have their own respective consensus mechanisms for the most part. But I also mentioned how VWAP aggregations and basically where this data in a closed source sense is being gathered from. And in this sense, we have seen instances whereby Oracle providers have been, let's say, a VWAP aggregation was incorrect on a Chainlink Oracle back for the wrap staked ETH feed on Arbitrum due to some sort of sandwich attack, a simple sandwich attack that occurred on mainnet, as well as we had a pool on Venus with SNBNB, where there was a Binance oracle being utilized, and it turned out that this Binance oracle was pointing at a UniV3 pool with $10 of liquidity as opposed to the one with millions. And then sort of the way that works, simply someone swapped and then price went to infinity, and it sort of stayed there because the traditional arbitrage assumption through UniV3 pools for the price to be reverted down to its market price value didn't really exist here because the pool was so small. And so in these instances, we sort of gauge and optimize accordingly as to how we actually determine oracles in general. Maybe also relating to TWAP oracles as well. And another thing I wanted to mention, like fallback mechanisms that are enshrined within the protocol. When we notice compound v3 utilizing TWAP oracles as a fallback for a Chainlink oracle we had maybe a year ago, where the price of Uni pumped like 40% in a few blocks. However, there was this fallback mechanism enshrined where if the price pumped too much, then we sort of revert to this fallback, and then they're accrued bad debt because of mispriced underlying assets with respect to the general market. So I guess in these instances, when we think about scoring blockchain networks, it's more about like, and something that will be enshrining with risk oracles, how we can have real-time risk analysis baked into smart contracts effectively, determines like this general, how can things be parameterized in a way that takes all of these things into consideration.
Thank you very much, Barry. So I think we really jumped into one topic that we didn't cover so far, which is the subject of on-chain oracles, because somehow like they open doors for price manipulations and for many other vector of attacks, but at the same time they look like the ideal solution from an ideal perspective, because you really want to have everything transparent on-chain. So maybe this is an open question for whoever wants to take it. I guess my question is more about, should we focus more on having everything on-chain as possible, which I guess this also applies to you, Brenda, for example, because somehow your oracle is fully on-chain but relies on a human component, or should we try to get as much as possible things to be deterministic and algorithmic, but still on-chain, or maybe off-chain is just a trade-off that we have to accept and like kind of deal with?
I think it goes back to the data quality and data definition. It happens to a lot of projects. As soon as you get enough liquidity and a centralized exchange picks you up, no matter what you do, the dexes are going to dry up. And it's going to be way easier to manipulate the price there if you're only pulling from there. So I think in general, it goes back to liquidity and how stable the asset can, or how stable of a definition you create that makes it as expensive as possible for anybody to manipulate it on-chain and off-chain. And I think merging maybe even both types of data could be helpful depending on what you're doing. Whether we know, I think the dream in general, and the reason that a lot of this has been developed is because we want a real alternative system to what we already had. I mean, 2008 and Bitcoin didn't come up because everything was happy-go-lucky. And so, yes, the dream would be like, we have all this liquidity on chain and we have all of this robustness straight into this independent system. Unfortunately, that's not what happens in real life. And I think for as long as everything continues to centralize, even to like Binance and Coinbase, we're gonna need better aggregations and better methods, even modeling methods, to mitigate the risk of what happens. But then that goes back to we wouldn't go as far as censoring what the user asks, but we always advise them and we always try to do our best to educate them into please do not use like one spot price for anything that you really want to, secure any amount of value that is worth,
Yes, we have the same issue with Curve. Like we have some built-in oracles which work decently well, but somehow they tend up to do the wrong thing every single time, and they use the spot price oracle. So yes, let's not get off track, but this is a common pain. And maybe continuing on the on-chain side of oracles, David, could Ajna to some extent become an on-chain sort of price, maybe powered by the moment at which liquidation has been executed somehow? Could that also be an additional oracle source, maybe to get some safety rails, or maybe not?
I think yes, but the answer is nuanced because the system and its participants don't produce a live price constantly. So, the lender will deposit at a price discount to market. The liquidator will purchase the collateral at a discount to market. So the price that you're going to get out of Ajna is always going to be some discount to market, but there's no way to deterministically get like what exact discount to market. You always know that it's just slightly below the actual value of what it is. So you can certainly use that data as like an additional source of data to like maybe validate a true market price. So if you have like an oracle that's showing that the ETH price right now is like $3,000, or like maybe not ETH, maybe because ETH is like super liquid and there's a million sources for information for it, but like, I don't know, like the optimism governance token or something. Well, guess what? Now that you have an Ajna market for it and a recent liquidation, you know that the current price is valid. You have some additional integrity that you can build into the oracle by using that data. Is it worth doing that? That's a different question. How complex is it? What's the overhead? Does it make sense? Maybe it does.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David. So getting back to Mario, I'm actually curious. We're running out of time, so I'll ask you to be brief because I want to give the opportunity also to other people to talk. But how come you decide with Pyth to go for to spin up a proper network? Like it's a Solana fork, I think. So how does that work? Why a network compared to just some off-chain source?
Yeah, so initially the idea from Pythnet actually came from, I believe it was around 2021, 2022, when Solana pretty much had a lot of congestion, especially with the NFT mints and all those things happening at the time. And some of the Oracle transactions that we submitted on-chain, especially for a lot of the protocols that were reliant on Pyth, couldn't land on-chain. So what ended up happening was a lot of these protocols that were reliant on the Pyth price updates, they couldn't pretty much get price updates on time, and it's also affected with a lot of their liquidation, with a lot of their kind of like matching engines and all those other things that could potentially have had a superior impact on their protocols. So what kind of like sparked the discussion of kind of like this Pythnet was pretty much coming from kind of like Solana downtime and all those things, coming from the 2021. Since then, Solana has become much better, but yeah, like kind of like that is kind of like what initially sparked the discussion, and also at the same time why we brought Pythnet in the first place.
Thank you very much for the insight on why you went on the on-chain approach. So we have 20 seconds left, so in a couple of words, question for Torgin and Barry. One piece of advice of what not to do when working with oracles to make sure that they stay censorship resistant, and yes. And I guess that we can wrap up.
So definitely don't use the spot price. I mean, actually, this is a bit weird because most off-chain oracles actually give you a spot price that's just aggregated from multiple sources, right? This is the VWAP as it's called, but really it's a spot price. So I think that's also something interesting to think about, is that, does that make sense for you? It really depends on what you're using the oracle price for, right? And so maybe using something like a time-weighted average can actually make a lot more sense depending on your use case. So yeah, I think basically think about what you actually care about, and it's probably not the spot price, right? And then use the oracle data accordingly.
Very one sentence. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay.
Let's do a round of applause for our panelists.